So today we're going to be diving in on this book. It's the Almanack of Naval Ravikant. So Naval is a super interesting guy. I had heard him on the Joe Rogan podcast a couple years ago, and a few months ago I was listening to this guy. His name's Chris Williamson. He has a podcast called the Modern Wisdom Podcast, and on that podcast he was asked a question of essentially, "Hey, you've gotten the chance to interview a ton of people. Who have you not gotten to talk to that you would love to get the chance to talk to?" And at the top of his list was this guy, Naval Ravikant. And so that stuck out to me. And then a few weeks ago, Chris Williamson was actually able to get Naval on his podcast. So that was awesome for him. And as I was listening to the podcast, they were going through a lot of the philosophical kind of ideas that he has about wealth and about happiness. And one of the things I was saying is that, hey, I don't really know too much about Naval and his history and kind of what his accomplishments were. And so as I was thinking about some of his principles, how he thinks about the world, one of the things I wanted to dive into was like, hey, what is his history? And that's something that I've been inspired to do more lately from David Sinra, right? I was listening to his founders podcast, which is absolutely incredible. I highly recommend you check it out. But one of the lessons that he talks about all the time is the importance of reading biographies and understanding people's stories. And he uses this quote from Charlie Munger. He says, when you're trying to teach the great concepts at work, I think it helps to tie them into the lives and personalities of the people who develop them. And so just all those kind of factors combined made me want to buy this book and do more research on this guy Naval and who he is and how he got to this stage in life. So that's what we're going to be talking through a little bit today. I'm going to go through some of his life stories that some of them are from the book, some of them I looked up. I'm going to go through some of the lessons that stuck out to me as I was going through that. And then after that, I'll dive into a few lessons from more of the kind of philosophical side, less tied to his direct experience, but more of the teachings that he has that really stuck out to me. So with that, a few things I will say about him from the get-go. He founded ePinions, which was kind of an early web review website. He's the founder of angellist.com, which you've probably heard of. It does a lot of angel investing in companies. So he's an icon in the Silicon Valley world and kind of startup culture. He was an early investor in companies like Uber, Twitter, Postmates, and a whole lot more. And like I said, I just heard him referenced from a lot of guys. And the foreword from this book is written by Tim Ferriss, and Tim Ferriss has many great things to say about him. So with that, let's kind of dive in on an early part in the book. So this is actually going to be Naval giving a little bit of an introduction to himself. So it says, I grew up in a single parent household with my mom working, going to school, and raising my brother and me as latchkey kids. We were very self-sufficient from a very early age. There was a lot of hardship, but everyone goes through hardship. It did help me in a number of ways. We were poor immigrants. My dad came to the US. He was a pharmacist in India, but his degree wasn't accepted here. So he worked in a hardware store. Not a great upbringing. My family split up. My mother uniquely provided against the backdrop of hardship, unconditional, and unfailing love. If you have nothing in your life, but you have at least one person that loves you unconditionally, it'll do wonders for your self-esteem. And so I'm going to pause right here because there's a few things. Number one, as I listen to the various podcasts that Naval has done with Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan and Chris Williamson, this is a common theme that he brings up all the time, the importance of the unconditional love that he received as a child from his mother. He talks a lot about how that gave him the confidence to be willing to fail because he knows that he had that unconditional love. Right. And he talks about, hey, if I could pass one thing on to my kids, like that's the thing that I want to do as a parent, is make sure that I'm providing the unconditional love for my kids, because it was so important that I had that as I was growing up. And right, if we think about Silicon Valley, we think about the startup culture where you have to be willing to fail. I think that makes a lot of sense. The other thing right here that I wrote down is this reminds me of Kobe talking about his dad. There's this really cool story. It's an interview with Kobe Bryant, and he's talking about how I think he's 10 or 11 years old at the time, and he's playing in this summer league. And throughout the entire summer, he doesn't score a single point in any of the games. He goes the whole summer without scoring, and he's upset, obviously, about it. And he talks about how his father told him, and that point, he said, listen, whether you score 0 or you're scoring 60, I'm going to love you no matter what. And Kobe says that that is the most important thing that you can tell a child, right? Because he says that gave me the confidence to go out and fail. Like I knew I could take those risks. I could go out there and try my best. And if I failed, I was still going to have that conditional love. Now, obviously, Kobe didn't want to settle for scoring 0 points, but he talks about how important that moment was of receiving that unconditional love from his father. And that really, when I read that story from Naval, that really resonated with that story from Kobe that I heard. So moving forward, we were in a part of New York City that isn't very safe. Basically, the library was my after school center. After I came back from school, I would just go straight to the library and hang out there until they closed. Then I would come home. That was my daily routine. We moved to the US when we were very young. I didn't have many friends, so I wasn't very confident. I spent a lot of time reading. My only real friends were books. Books make for great friends because the best thinkers of the last few thousand years tell you their nuggets of wisdom. So I'm going to pause here. If you've listened to the last podcast I had on Ben Franklin and several of the other ones, Charlie Munger, I haven't done one on Jocko yet, but that's another one that I listen to a lot. All of these people are ferocious readers. They read all the time. And that's what Naval is doing here. There's so many times throughout this book and throughout the podcast when I was listening to Naval where he references the importance of reading. And he's got a bunch of great quotes on this. And obviously it started here as early on in his life as a child, but I'm just going to read you some of the quotes that I pulled about his thoughts on reading because they're just so important. The first one is, no book in the library should scare you. Whether it's math, physics, electrical engineering, sociology, or an economics books, you should be able to take any book down off the shelf and read it. A number of them are going to be difficult for you. That's okay. Read them anyways. Then go back and reread them and reread them. I highlighted that one because I loved that first line. No book in the library should scare you. That's a fantastic line. Another quote from the book. I probably read 1 to 2 hours a day. That puts me in the top 0.00001%. I think that alone accounts for any material success I've had in my life and any intelligence I might have. Making it an actual habit is the most important thing. I'm going to say that again. He says, I think that alone counts for any material success I've had in my life and any intelligence I might have, right? I'm thinking back to the Ben Franklin story where when he was a kid, he would stay up all throughout the night because he would borrow books from the booksellers, right? Because they would close down at night. He would go grab the books. He would read those books. He would stay up all night reading the books and then return them in the morning before the shop opened just so he could read those books. Another quote from Naval. The genuine love for reading itself when cultivated is a superpower. We live in the age of Alexandria when every book and every piece of knowledge ever written down is a fingertip away. The means of learning are abundant. It's the desire to learn that is scarce, right? And then two more things here. I know I'm reiterating this a lot. I'm kind of stealing David Sinra's repetition is persuasive because I'm telling you, as I listen to him, he mentions this over and over and over again. He gets asked a question. If you had to pass down to your kids 1 or 2 principles, what would they be? He says, number 1, read everything you can. And then the last thing I can't remember which podcast it was on. I want to say it was toward the end of the one of the Tim Ferriss ones, but he makes this analogy that reading is essentially the meta skills of all skills, because if you learn how to read, you essentially are learning how to learn, and then you can take that and go learn anything you need to. So that is another reason why he puts so much emphasis on reading. Like, hey, if you can learn this skill, if you can learn to love reading, you can teach yourself whatever you need to do. So that was just something that stuck out to me. Like I said, as I listen to him, he talks about this over and over and over again. And he talks about how this habit of his started at a very, very early age. All right, moving forward. Actually, I'm going to pause right here because I want to talk about a tweet that he has. So if you've heard of Naval before, you've probably heard or seen this tweet that he has. I think it's actually pinned to the top of his Twitter. It's a Twitter thread. I'm not sure what to call it now that it's called X, but it's a thread all about how to build wealth. And it's actually an incredibly good thread. I'm not going to go through too much of it here because if you listen to his content, and it's what he talks about a lot. And this book in particular goes through a ton of his philosophy about how to create wealth. Essentially, kind of at its core, one of his core beliefs is that wealth creation is a skill. And that's what he talks about a lot in this Twitter thread and in this book. But the reason that I wanted to talk about it is because when he talks in interviews about this Twitter thread that he's kind of infamous for, he talks about how he was 13 years old when he developed all of these ideas. So these, even though he posted it on Twitter decades later, he says they're all ideas that he had formulated by the time he was 13 through all of this reading that he had done, right? And one of the quotes that stuck out to me when he was on the Tim Ferriss podcast, I think it was the very first Tim Ferriss podcast that he did, he says, a lot of growing up was watching the ideal American lifestyle, but sort of from the other side of the window pane, with my nose pressed up against the glass and saying, yeah, I want that too. And I want that for myself and my kids. So I grew up with a very dark view of the world on the other side of the tracks, right? So remember, he's an immigrant. He moved to America when he was 9 years old. He had an older brother who was 11. His parents split up, so his mom's watching him. And he's spending all night reading at the library. And he's saying here, like, hey, I knew I was poor and I saw this ideal American lifestyle that I wanted to have, but I did not have it yet. And I felt like I was on the other side of the glass looking out at this lifestyle I had. And so as I'm reading this, I'm thinking like, okay, he's reading and he's building this framework in his head of like, hey, how am I going to escape this, right? He's talking about how he wants to get to the other side of the tracks. And he's developed this idea, this Twitter thread, by the time he's 13 years old on how he's going to do that. He's trying to figure out, hey, how am I actually going to accomplish my goal of getting myself out of the situation I'm in? All that said, one of the tweets in the thread that really stuck out to me, this is actually the second half of one of the earlier parts in the thread. He says, if you secretly despise wealth, it will elude you. And I thought this was super insightful. I can't imagine being 13 years old, being able to have this foresight, but being able to say, hey, even though I'm on this side of the train tracks that I don't want to be on right now, if I have resentment for the people who are on the other side, if I despise wealth, it is going to elude me, right? This reminded me a few weeks ago, we talked about Charlie Munger, right? And hey, one of the best ways to live a miserable life is to have a bunch of resentment. And here, by the time he's 13 years old, he already understands like, hey, that's the life that I want to get to. I cannot despise wealth. I cannot be resentful toward those people on the other side of the tracks, or else this whole wealth thing is going to elude me. And I thought that was just fascinating to have that insight at the age of 13 years old, because even now, as I'm reading it, in my 30s, that line when I read it was just incredibly powerful and just a great frame to think about it in. Another part of that viral tweet that I really liked was seek wealth, not money or status. Wealth is having assets that earn while you sleep. Money is how we transfer time and wealth, and status is your place in the social hierarchy. So like I said, just an incredible Twitter thread, incredible to think that he's done this at 13 years old and he's already accumulated this much knowledge and understanding of how the world works because of how much reading he has put in. And like I said, the other note I have is just wealth creation is a skill. I think that's a fantastic frame to think about it. And obviously, if you listen to him, that's one of his just core beliefs, is that wealth creation is a skill, and that's what he's trying to pass on. So here we go, back to the book, back to Naval, kind of explaining his upbringing. My first job was with an illegal catering company in the back of a van delivering Indian food when I was 15. Even when I was younger, I had a paper route and I washed dishes in the cafeteria. I was a totally unknown kid in New York City from a nothing family and immigrants trying to survive situation. Then I passed the test to get into Stuyvesant High School. I'm not sure if I'm actually saying that right. That saved my life because once I had the Stuyvesant brand, I got into an Ivy League college, which led me into tech. Stuyvesant is one of those intelligence lottery situations where you can break in with instant validation. You go from being blue collar to white collar in one move. So as I was reading this down, what I wrote down in the book was opportunity handled well leads to more opportunity. This is another idea that I've heard David Sinra talk about a lot on his Founders podcast. And the reason I wrote that is just he knows that he wants to change his life. He's started thinking about how he's going to do that. All of this reading he has done allows him to be prepared for this situation where he needs to take a test to get into this prestigious high school that's going to change the course of his life. And that's what he says right here. Hey, I passed this test to get into this high school, and that completely changed the trajectory of my life. He calls it an intelligence lottery ticket, because once he gets into that high school, now he has access to all of these Ivy League schools, and he ends up going to Dartmouth. So it ends up paying off for him. So he says, at Dartmouth, I studied economics and computer science, and there was a time when I thought I was going to be a PhD in economics. So that's him covering his kind of early childhood. I'm going to touch on one of the stories that I found There's a bunch of great stories that I found that I'm not even going to have time to mention today. But one of the ones that I thought was really great was this story about how he was interning at a New York City big law firm, right? So he's in college, like we've talked about. He grew up poor. He's been wanting to make it, and he finally gets this internship at this really prestigious law firm in New York where he's getting a whole lot of pay. And he actually ends up, I think it was 2 or 3 months into the internship, getting fired because he's so bored and he doesn't want to sit there bored all day because they don't have anything to give him. So they just have him print stuff from time to time, and they just have small tasks from every now and then. And he's completely losing his mind. I'll actually just read what he says because it's just hilarious to hear him talk about it. He says, "I worked at a law firm for a while, a big prestigious law firm in New York City. I had a big internship there, and I basically got fired for surfing Usenet back in the day. This is before the internet was a big thing. Using it was the news groups, and it was the only way for me to stay from completely being bored. And I was an overpaid guy wearing a tie and a suit that's hanging out in the conference room where the lawyers need photocopies. So I would be making photocopies. And in the meantime, I would be bored out of my skull. I used to read the Wall Street Journal or anything I could get my hands on. I would have read the back of a brochure just to keep me from going insane because listening to a bunch of corporate lawyers discuss how to optimize minute details in a big contract is really dull. And they got mad at me because they wanted me to sit quietly and to not read the Wall Street Journal. They said that's rude, that's misbehavior. So I got called up and reprimanded a bunch of times, and then I was finally terminated and sent home in shame early from my very prestigious internship, destroying my chance of going to law school. And I was unhappy for all of an hour. But ultimately, it's one of the best things that ever happened to me because then I would have ended up as a lawyer. And not that I have anything against lawyers, but it's not what I was meant to do." So I think that's just a super interesting story from his life. Just remembering the context of he's this poor immigrant who's come to the United States. He's trying to make it to the other side. He sees this ideal American lifestyle, and he finally gets this big law internship and ends up after 2 or 3 months getting fired from that and going home in shame. And even though there was a great opportunity, he had a bunch of money, he even says then, I was unhappy for all of an hour. So he even knew then, like, hey, even though this was a chance for me to make a bunch of money, this isn't for me to do. So I'm happy that it ended this way. So I think that's just an incredible perspective to have at this age, and just a super interesting story to understand from his younger years. And one of the things I kind of noted as I was reading this was pursue independence and freedom. This is one of the things that Charlie Munger talked about a lot, right? Charlie Munger wasn't pursuing wealth. He was pursuing freedom and independence, and wealth was a mechanism for him to accomplish that. And I think it's the same thing here, right? Because Naval could have made a whole lot of money sticking with this law route, but he wanted more to be interested, stimulated, and have the freedom and independence. And that's just something that he mentions a lot throughout the podcast and the interviews that he does, is how important the independence was for him. He wanted freedom. He wanted independence. That is what he was shooting for. And the wealth kind of came as a byproduct. All right. So I'm going to put this book down. I'm going to talk about a few other stories that I was able to find scattered throughout some of the podcasts and research. So after he graduates from Dartmouth, it looks like he briefly worked at Boston Consulting Group, which is a really prestigious kind of consulting group. So just interesting to know that, because that means he was still doing extremely well in school. Those companies are not easy to get into. But I don't think he lasts there very long. He ends up moving to Silicon Valley and working at a company called At Home. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting there is while he was there, he talks about how early on in his employment at this company, he starts telling everybody that he wants to start his own company and that's what he's going to do. And he talks about how he's been telling people this and he's been talking about it for months. And after like 6 or 9 months, a bunch of people start just making a comment to him like, hey, man, you said for the last like several months that you're going to start your own company. Like, you're still here. What are you doing here? And he actually mentions that it's that peer pressure that leads him to just essentially feel the peer pressure to leave the company and start his own thing, right? So I just thought that was interesting because, you know, he kind of has this plan on how he's going to get wealthy. And he's thought through a lot of these things a whole lot. And even still, it takes that peer pressure of having told people that this is what I'm going to do and them holding him to it to actually kind of force him to make that move, leave the big company and go start his own thing. So after that, he does end up in 1999 when he's 25 years old. He's going to start this company called Opinions. All right. So Opinions is a consumer review platform. And think about it, it's 1999. Obviously, we're getting close to the .com bubble here. And so this company is kind of like a precursor to sites like Yelp or TripAdvisor, where it's kind of crowdsourcing reviews. Because I think that just wasn't quite a thing this early on in the internet. So the company gets $8 million in seed funding. They eventually raise $45 million, which is a whole lot of money. That's really impressive. And in 2001, Naval ends up actually leaving the company. So I wasn't able to find too many details as to why he left in 2001 at the time that he did, about 2 years after they had started it. But essentially, him and a couple of the other co-founders decided to leave, split off, work on some other things. And then in 2003, a few years later, Opinions actually merges with a company called Deal Time, and they're going to form an organization called Shopping.com. All right. And so once they do that merge, one of the things that happens is obviously all the founders and all the people on the board need to vote to approve that merger. And Naval is one of those people that needs to vote to approve. And one of the interesting things that happens here, and I'm going to talk about this because we're going to learn kind of one of the big moments in Naval's life that's going to teach us a lesson that I think kind of has led to some of the different lessons that I've learned from him, and just some of the different teachings that he has kind of revolves around this lesson. So that's why I'm highlighting this story. So when Opinions goes to merge with Deal.com, what happens is by this time Opinions has, like I said, they've raised $45 million. But they think that Opinions is probably valued between $23 and $38 million. So what that means is that the co-founders, including Naval, are actually going to, in order to approve that merger, they're going to need to sign off that their shares go to zero, right? Because they've raised more money than the company's even worth. So all of the founders' shares are just worthless because the company is not even worth more than the money that has been put in at this point. So in order to make the merger go through, Naval and the other founders have to sign off that all their shares are worth nothing. So they're essentially like cutting their losses and saying like, hey, I'm not going to get anything from this whole Opinions project. So they end up signing that. The merger happens. And then 1 year later, Shopping.com, which is the merged company, ends up selling for, I want to say it was like $750 million. All right. So magically, this company that like, hey, it was worth zero, they merge, and then a year later, it's worth $750 million. All right. Well, not worth zero, worth 22 to 38. And apparently one of the things that had happened there was the company, the founder that was still operating Opinions, they had actually closed a deal with Google that was going to boost revenues. I think it said by 1,400%, right? But the thing is, Naval and the other co-founders did not know that was the case. So when they were signing off for their shares to go down to zero, they had no idea that there was this deal in place that was about to significantly boost the revenue that was coming into Opinions. So essentially the venture capitalist and the founder that was still working at Opinions intentionally withheld that information from Naval and the other co-founders so that they would sign off that their shares were worth zero so that they wouldn't get any of the benefit, obviously a year later when Opinions sold for $750 million. So that was a big moment in Naval's life. I mean, I can't imagine starting a company, being a founder, and then going through that experience with the venture capitalist that invested in the company and one of your other founders. Obviously, Naval ends up taking them to court and suing them over that to get some of his money back. It ended up settling for an undisclosed amount. But just this experience, it leads to Naval actually being called radioactive mud in Silicon Valley because he's essentially suing the venture capitalists that invested in them, right? And so if you're in Silicon Valley and you're trying to build startups, you need investment from venture capitalists, and having the reputation of suing venture capitalists as you have worked for is not the best look on the outside without knowing the context within it. So all of that said, why am I telling you this story outside of the fact that it's just a crazy life experience to go through? One of the things that Naval says a lot, that it's a line that I really liked, is he's got this line where he says, if you're so smart, why aren't you happy? Right. And that's just a really great line that has stuck with me because he talks about the same way he talks about how wealth is a skill. He talks about how happiness is a skill that he thinks you can develop. And so he has this kind of concept of, if you're so smart, why aren't you happy? So why am I mentioning this right now? Well, one of the questions he gets asked in the book is, what's the biggest mistake you've made in your life and how did you recover? And I thought his answer was fascinating. So this is his answer. He says, really, I wish I had done all of the same things, but with less emotion and less anger. The most celebrated example would be when I was younger. I started a company. This company did well, but I didn't do well. So I sued some of the people involved. It was a good outcome for me in the end, and everything worked out okay. But there was a lot of angst and a lot of anger. Today, I wouldn't have the angst and the anger. I would have just walked up to the people and said, look, this is what happened. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to do it. This is what's fair. This is what's not. I would have realized that the anger and the emotions are a huge, completely unnecessary consequence. Now I'm trying to learn from that and do the same things I think are the right things to do, but without anger and with a very long-term point of view. If you take a very long-term point of view and take the emotion out of it, I wouldn't consider those things mistakes anymore. So I think that's a great kind of experience when you tie into this thing that he always talks about, like, hey, if you're so smart, why aren't you happy? That's one of the things he talks about is like, hey, in life, especially if you're in the startup world, you're going to have all of these roller coasters of ups and downs, right? And there's going to be times where the business is bad and there's going to be times when the business is doing good. And you just have to accept that. And if you can't figure out how to be happy in the times that the business is doing bad, that's just going to be a bad situation for you in life, right? And that's why he says that line. If you're so smart, why aren't you happy? If you're smart, you should be able to get yourself to be happy throughout all these scenarios, no matter what's going on, because you've got to expect those low points to come, right? You have to be able to live your life in a way where you can be happy despite all of this chaos and all of these bad things happening around you. And I think that's just a really cool story to hear from him of, hey, if I could go back and do one thing different in this situation, it would be to try to kind of maintain my emotions, maintain my happiness despite everything that's going on, because I can do all the things that I need to do without all of the anger and all of the angst that went along with it. So like I said, that's just a great example. When you hear him talk, when you listen to this podcast, you're going to hear him talk about this skill of being happy all the time. And this was a really powerful example for me to understand, okay, like this is a story from his life, especially early on in his career, where this lesson that he talks about all the time could be applied and where he learned it. Or I'm sure one of the many times he learned it. Another one of the lessons that really stuck out to me from reading Naval was he has this line where he talks about watching how other people treat their enemies, because it's just a matter of time till in a certain context they're going to see you as their enemy. That was a really good lesson I like, right? Because someone was asking him about, hey, how do you decide who to go into business with? And he said, like, hey, I just look to see, or I first check to see how they treat their enemies, because I know one day I'm going to be on the other side of that. So let me just read you his quote. He says, when you're in a relationship, just watch how the other person treats their worst enemy, because eventually they'll redefine you as an enemy and you'll get to feel this behavior. So I think the number one criterion I look for in a relationship is that a person has to be kind. They just have to be a nice person, because in a certain context, you can always be reclassified from friend to enemy. I'm going to read that part again, because in a certain context, you can always be reclassified from a friend to an enemy. When I read about that, I think back to this opinion story where, hey, one of his other co-founders and and the venture capitalists that were backing opinions essentially turned him and the other co-founders into enemies, right? So these people that they were friends with ended up turning Naval and some of the other co-founders into enemies, and then essentially screwing them out of the money in that deal. So he's not just saying this as a philosophical thing that he hasn't lived through. He's saying this as someone who has experienced this process before. Back to finishing off that quote, he says, so you just want to see the boundaries of someone's ethics. If you see someone being a bad server, or someone engaging in unethical behavior, or suing other people, or just fighting other people all the time, it's only a matter of time before they fight you. So just stay away from these high conflict people. All right. So those were two really big lessons that I have heard Naval talking about in a lot of his podcasts, but I didn't have the understanding of the story of opinions and kind of everything that he went through from that to see how they applied to certain stories from his life. So I just thought that was super interesting, going back and finding those stories to kind of take these lessons that Naval is telling us in these podcasts and actually find those moments from his career to kind of stick them to. All right. So one of the interesting things that happens after this whole kind of fallout over opinions is Naval is going to start this blog called Venture Hacks. And what Venture Hacks is, it's a blog focused on educating entrepreneurs just about fundraising and kind of navigating the venture capital landscape, right? Because he's essentially gone through this entire process with opinions where he has so many different learnings, and this is early on kind of in the venture capital space. And so he's got a ton of learnings going on. Obviously, he raised a bunch of money. The company did moderately well while he was there, did really well after he was there and then got screwed out of the deal and all of these things. So now he's taking the time to kind of pass on some of those learnings through this blog. And what happens is Venture Hacks is actually going to end up being the stepping stone for AngelList. And that's one of the reasons I want to talk about it. And so I actually ChatGPT to give me a little bit of a description. It says the blog tested their ideas about making startup funding more accessible and transparent. And by sharing advice and building a community of founders and investors, they laid the groundwork for AngelList's platform, which directly connected startups with angels. And by what they mean by that is angel investors. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this is the way he approaches venture hacks matches really well with his idea that he talks about in a lot of the podcasts. So one of the things he says in the podcast and on this book is he says, I want to live life in a way where if it played out 1,000 times, Naval is successful 999 times. And I thought that was a super interesting kind of frame to think about it. And like, hey, you don't exactly know what the outcomes are going to end up being, but I want to live this life in a way that if it was lived 999 times, I want to be successful 1,000 times. So essentially trying to make success as deterministic as possible. And as I was thinking about this, I did find a YouTube clip where he actually talks about how to live life in a way that would make generating wealth as deterministic as it could be. So I want to tell you the quote from this clip real quick. Naval says, if you want to make the maximum amount of money possible, like if you just want to get rich over your life in a deterministic, predictable way, here's what you would do. You would stay on the bleeding edge of trends. You would study technology, design, art, and other fields that you think are relevant. You would become really good at something, essentially waiting for your moment until something emerges in the world where your skill set is needed and you're uniquely qualified. In the meantime, you would build your brand on platforms like Twitter and YouTube by giving away free work so people know who you are. You would make a name for yourself and take some risks in the process. Then, when the time comes to seize that opportunity, you would do so with maximum leverage. This means having people work for you, securing funds or capital, writing a book, coding, and building a media presence. So why am I talking about this learning right now, right? So this idea of kind of trying to make success a deterministic outcome, right? If I live my life 100 times, I want to be successful 999 times. Well, the reason is this description that he has of making money in a deterministic, predictable way is almost exactly the playbook that he uses with venture hacks that then is the stepping stone for AngelList, right? He talks about you want to stay on the bleeding edge of trends, right? This guy is involved in the wave of the internet, the dot-com bubble. He's made it through the crash. He's at the forefront of this technological movement that is the internet. You would study technology, design, art, and other fields that you think are relevant, right? He's reading a ton. Like I said, he's already in the mix with the internet. He's doing that. You would become really good at something, essentially waiting for your moment, right? He's gotten really good at building a company and understanding the venture capital world. He's built a company. He's been through a lot of these things. And he says, in the meantime, you would build your brand on platforms like Twitter and YouTube. And what is he doing with venture hacks? He is writing a blog. He's giving away all of this information for free that he has learned over the last 7 years. And what's going to end up happening is by writing this blog, a bunch of people are going to get drawn to it. And he ends up building this community of the venture capitalists who are reading his blogs, as well as founders who are reading his blogs to try to understand this process. And by building that community, that essentially sets the foundation that becomes AngelList, right? Because essentially AngelList is a marketplace for these founders and venture capitalists to meet one another. And that way the venture capitalists can invest in the founders can understand the venture capitalists and have a higher level of trust with them, and just build this community that people have a lot higher trust. So he essentially is taking this playbook that he has of making money in a deterministic way, and this is the plays that he is running with venture hacks, right? So once I heard the venture hack stories, like I said, he just doesn't talk about these stories as much in these podcasts, which is kind of an admirable thing, because he's at this point, he doesn't want to look back into the past. He doesn't want to talk about the successes that he's had, but he is talking about a lot of these lessons. So as I'm reading this book and as I'm listening to these podcasts and I'm hearing the lessons, and then once I did the research to be able to find a lot of these stories, it just helped me connect a lot of the dots from his life of saying like, all right, here's this clip of him talking about how to make money in a deterministic way. But even better, here's the actual example from his life on how he played it out. And you can see where he almost does it literally step by step, runs that play to reach the level that he did. So I just thought that was a fascinating aspect to the story that I didn't know about Naval and how he got AngelList actually started and set the foundation for that. So with that, that kind of is going to be the stopping point for the lessons that I learned from actual stories in his life. But there's still a few more ideas that I want to touch on just from his teachings and from the podcast. They just resonated with me personally for whatever reason. So the first one is this idea that success takes an indeterminate amount of time. If you're counting, you'll run out of patience before it actually arrives. So I love this quote. I love that frame of it being an indeterminate amount of time. I'm going to read a quote from him so that makes it a little bit more sense. He says, "One thing I figured out later in life is generally great people have great outcomes. You just have to be patient. Every person I met at the beginning of my career 20 years ago, where I looked at them and said, wow, that guy or gal is super capable, so smart and dedicated. All of them, almost without exception, became extremely successful. You just had to give them a long enough time scale. It never happens in the time scale you want or they want, but it does happen. It takes time. Even once you have all the pieces in place, there's an indeterminate amount of time you have to put in. If you're counting, you'll run out of patience before success actually arrives." I think that's just a great frame. You've got to put in the work. You've got to do those things. But if you're counting how long it's taking to reach that end goal, you're going to run out of patience before success actually arrives. I think that's super important lesson for me, especially right now. I'm early 30s. I still have a very long career ahead of me. I cannot be counting time. It's just got to be putting in the work. And one of the things this actually reminded me of was the Sam Walton story. I've been listening to David Senra's Founders podcast, obviously a lot. I've already mentioned it a few times on this podcast. But one of the stories from Sam Walton that David tells is how Sam Walton was building up one of his first stores, and he had been building this store for 5 years. And apparently the lease wasn't set up in an optimal way for him. So at the end of this 5-year lease, the landlord actually just takes the store away from him because according to the lease, he can, and because the landlord, I think he wants to give it to his kid. And so essentially what happens for Sam Walton is he spends 5 years, he's got one store building up the store. He's doing an incredible job. And then one day he just gets it all taken away from him and he has to restart. Right. And that just really resonated with me. Like, hey, he's already being successful. Now he has to restart. If you're counting the time that you're going to be successful, that would have just broken him in that moment. So like I said, I thought that was a really good lesson from Naval. You got to put the work in, but you've got to understand it's going to be an indeterminate amount of time that you have to put in, and you can't count along the way. All right. Another lesson that just really stuck with me is something that Naval calls playing long-term games with long-term people. And here he's going to talk about compounding trust, which if you listen to the Charlie Munger podcast we did, this was a huge part of it, the importance of trust. And he even actually mentions Warren Buffett here. So that's one of the reasons I like it. So here we go, diving in on the book. He says, compounding in business relationships is very important. Look at some of the top roles in society, like why someone is a CEO of a public company or managing billions of dollars. It's because people trust them. They are trusted because the relationships they've built and the work they've done have compounded. They've stuck with the business and shown themselves in a visible and accountable way to be very high integrity people. Compound interest also happens in your reputation. If you have a sterling reputation and you keep building it for decades upon decades, people will notice. Your reputation will literally end up being thousands or tens of thousands times more valuable than somebody else who is very talented but is not keeping the compound interest and reputation going. Right. So I think that's just a fascinating way to look at it. Why do people reach these high levels in organizations? How do you become a CEO of a public company or responsible for managing billions of dollars? Yes, you need to have skills and things, but ultimately it comes down to people trusting you. Do people have trust in you to execute the work that you need to do? And I love this example that he has about Warren Buffett. This back to the book, Naval says, demonstrated judgment, credibility around the judgment is so critical. Warren Buffett wins here because he has massive credibility. He's been highly accountable. He's been right over and over in the public domain. He's built a reputation for very high integrity, so you can trust him. People will throw infinite leverage behind him because of his judgment. Nobody asks him how hard he works. That line hit me like a baseball bat. Nobody asks him how hard he works. Nobody asks him when he wakes up or when he goes to sleep. They're like, Warren, just do your thing. Judgment, especially demonstrated judgment with high accountability and a clear track record, is critical. So like I said, I just love that line. Obviously, it ties into a million of the things. Earlier when it talks about compounding interest also happens in your reputation. We talked about on a previous podcast when Salomon Brothers had their all the issues that happened. I want to say it was the late 1980s, early 1990s. And Warren Buffett went in front of Congress and said, hey, I'm okay if you lose me a little bit of money, but if you lose a shred of reputation, I will be ruthless, right? This idea that your reputation compounds, and that this framing from Naval helped me understand that quote from Warren Buffett on, hey, if you lose a shred of my reputation, I will be ruthless. It's because that reputation, that trust is so much more valuable for Warren Buffett than the dollars that some trader at Salomon Brothers may make or lose on a single bet, right? That is nothing compared to the importance of the reputation that Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger had built. And that's why it kind of connected the dots for me. That's why Warren Buffett would be so much more ruthless about losing a shred of reputation. That is so much more important to Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger than the money that would be made. All right. There's also this idea, especially if you listen to the Modern Wisdom podcast that came out recently. They talk a lot about kind of this idea that Chris ends up calling holistic selfishness. I'm not even going to try to explain it too much, but essentially one of the things that you'll hear Naval say over and over and over again is kind of this idea of like, hey, I want to do what I want to do. And if it's not something I want to do right now, then I'm not going to do it. Right. One of the funny things he says is that his wife is not allowed to schedule anything for him. So she can't schedule dinners. She doesn't get to commit him going to weddings or anything like that. And he doesn't really even do much forward planning himself. He talks about, hey, like the worst thing is when you've committed yourself to something in the future and then the day comes and you don't even want to do it. And he talks about how much he hates that. And there's just a bunch of examples where they talk about that. And one of the things I was trying to understand is like, hey, what's kind of the logic behind there? And partly because I've kind of thought about this about myself before, right? Like I think of myself, for better or for worse, as kind of a selfish person, but I think of it in a frame of like, if you have your selfishness, or if you kind of have things calibrated appropriately, what's best for you is also best for everyone else. So it should kind of match. And as I was thinking through this, as I was listening to him on Chris Williamson, and they were talking about this holistic selfishness, this idea kind of came to my mind, and it's from a Jeff Bezos 2010 letter to shareholders. And I'm going to say it and then I'll tie it back so you can understand what I'm trying to get out here. I don't think I'm going to explain it perfectly well, but I'm going to play with this idea a little bit. In that letter to shareholders, Jeff Bezos says, we have an unshakable conviction that the long-term interests of share owners are perfectly aligned with the interests of customers. So that's a super interesting perspective, because essentially what he's saying there is there's not really trade-offs there. There's not a time where we're going to have to make a decision where, oh, this is good for the customers, but it's not good for our shareholders, maybe because we're spending extra money or something, right? And this frame that Jeff Bezos is putting out, he's saying, hey, we have an unshakable conviction. I love that word, unshakable. He's pretty much saying, like, there's no way you can convince me out of this, that the long-term interests of the share owners are perfectly aligned with the interests of the customers, right? And so how does this apply to Naval's idea of holistic selfishness? Kind of what I'm thinking right now is, hey, the long-term interest of everybody else, along with the long-term interest of you individually, are perfectly aligned, right? So as long as you can calibrate that correctly, you can act in a way where you do things that are holistically selfish for you. They are selfish for you in the moment, but if you have a long-term view, it'll be aligned with everyone else. Now, the problem would then become like, hey, if you're taking a short-term view on things, that's when things can get out of whack. But if you're taking an extremely long-term view, which both Naval and Jeff Bezos talk about all the time, that selfishness should be calibrated to be the same, right? And essentially, kind of some of the metaphors he uses, he has this metaphor called the stag hunt. And essentially kind of the end of the story is saying like, hey, it is a selfish thing to be honest and be of high integrity and to have high trust, because if I do those things, I'm going to attract people who are honest and have high integrity and have high trust, right? And so I want to selfishly be a good person for the long term, because that's going to help me in the long term. And so I think that was kind of the frame of the holistic selfishness there. Like I said, this whole last 2 or 3 minutes has been kind of a little bit of a tangent, because it's an idea that I'm playing with. I'm trying to understand better, but like I said, if you listen to the Modern Wisdom podcast, he talks about it a lot. And it was just something that I was thinking about, like, hey, how do I explain this? How do I understand this? And how do I take it as a lesson that I can apply in my life and think about that way? So I still think I have a lot of understanding to do on that part. But that's my first take. Maybe in a few months, I'll have a better explanation for it. Moving on to another lesson, he said this several times throughout the podcast. I want to say he said it more on the Tim Ferriss podcast, but he's got this idea that all learning is error correction. And I had never heard of this that framing before. He says, all learning is error correction. Every knowledge creation system works through correcting errors, making guesses, and correcting errors. So by definition, if you're learning, you're going to be wrong. You're going to be wrong most of the time, and you'll be updating your prior. So I love that frame, just because with that definition that all learning is error correction, that just is built-in failure, right? So you know that, hey, if I'm going to learn, I'm going to be failing a bunch along the way, and I'm going to make a bunch of mistakes, and that's fine because that is part of the learning process. I just need to correct my errors, right? And that even ties into one of Alex Hormozy's definition of learning. And once I read Charlie Munger, I actually realized that Alex Hormozy got it from Charlie Munger, and I'm sure Charlie Munger got it from somebody else. But this idea that learning isn't just the accumulation of knowledge, it's actually changing your behavior, right? If you don't actually change your behavior, you haven't learned anything, right? It's not just the accumulation of knowledge. And I think this definition of all learning is error correction ties right into that, right? It's that change in behavior. You have to correct the error, and then that's how you will learn. So I love that frame. Another note that I wrote myself there is this is an important concept to remember when you're leading with subordinates as well. And honestly, leading up the chain of command is other people are going to make a mistake, and that's their learning process as well. So whether you're a leader and you're leading down the chain of command, understanding that, hey, the people below you are learning, and therefore they're going to have errors and they're going to have error corrections, and you need to understand that and be patient with them. And same thing up the chain of command, the people above you are learning as well, and make sure just to understand that. I know early on in my career, that was something that I didn't quite understand. It didn't give the people above me in the chain of command the grace that they deserved because they were still learning as well. But yeah, like I said, just that frame, all learning is error correction. Really love that frame. Moving on to the next idea, all greatness comes from suffering. There's a part in the book. Actually, this is from Tribe of Mentors book, which is a Tim Ferriss book where he has a bunch of bits of wisdom from, I want to say, several hundreds of people, and Naval is one of the people in there. And one of the comments that Naval had is, suffering is a moment of clarity when you can no longer deny the truth of a situation and you are forced into an uncomfortable change. And then a little bit later, he said, inside suffering is the seed of change. When I read this, I was reminded of Jensen Huang. So I'm going to reference Founders Podcast again. I forget what number it was, but it was relatively recently where David Sinra did a podcast on Jensen Huang. And one of the things that he talks about over and over, it's like essentially the common theme of Jensen's life is, hey, if you want to get better and if you want to be successful, I wish upon you plenty of suffering. That's something that Jensen says all the time. And as David Sinra goes through Jensen's life, it's just full of suffering, from immigrating to the United States, getting bullied as a kid in school and suffering through that. The entire first 10 or 15 years of NVIDIA is just a grueling process of them trying to grow, and Jensen suffering through all of this pain trying to get this company built. It was just, it was the theme of that podcast. At least the theme that I walked away with was, hey, in Jensen's view of the world, if you want to be successful, I wish upon you plenty of suffering, right? And so when I read this quote from Naval, that inside suffering is the seed of change, I thought that was really great, because he's essentially saying, like, hey, that is a necessary part of the process that you're going to go through. And just kind of that frame of, hey, suffering is a moment of clarity when you can no longer deny the truth of a situation and you are forced into an uncomfortable change, right? So that actually even ties into the error correction, because the error correction is, hey, you're confronted with the truth that you see that you need to make this change. And so there's going to be a little bit of suffering involved there. Understand that that's part of the process. And I think if you can even calibrate it correctly, you can start kind of understanding in your head, hey, this suffering is good because the fact that I'm suffering means that if I learn from this experience, that's what's going to lead me to grow. So anyways, I thought that was a fantastic line. I've only got two more, so we're almost toward the end here. Another idea, play wealth games, not status games. So this is something that Naval talks a lot about, because wealth games he seems as positive sum, which they are, versus status games where he kind of frames them as zero sum I'm going to quote Naval directly here. He says there are fundamentally two huge games in life that people play. One is the money game, because money is not going to solve all of your problems, but it's going to solve all of your money problems. People realize that, so they want to make money. But at the same time, many of them deep down believe they can't make money. They don't want any wealth creation to happen. So they attack the whole enterprise by saying, well, making money is evil. You shouldn't do it. But they're actually playing the other game, which is the status game. They're trying to be high status in the eyes of other people watching by saying, well, I don't need money. We don't want money. Status is the ranking in the social hierarchy. Status is a zero-sum game. It's a very old game. We've been playing it since monkey tribes. It's hierarchical. It's who's number one, who's number two, who's number three. And for number three to move to number two has to move out of the slot. So status is a zero-sum game. So I thought that was super interesting, right? And one of the examples that they talk about, I want to say this is from the Modern Wisdom podcast, where it's just like the ranking on the Billboard charts, right? Like, hey, if you're the number one, it's just live all the time. Here are the top 10 artists of today, and that's a status game, right? Because you're either number two or number one. Now, it doesn't matter if all of the top 10 people are making way more money than they did 10 years ago. If that would be looking at as a wealth positive sum games. Like, hey, yes, you're ranked number 5 still, but number 5 is making a ton of money and you're doing great. That's a wealth creation game, versus if you're looking at it from a status game, that's just zero sum. And then one of the other things I was thinking about here was kind of going back to the example from the Charlie Munger podcast, where they're talking about envy, right? And they talk about how it's not greed that drives the world, but it's actually envy that drives the world. And Warren Buffett gives this example of how you can give someone a $2 million bonus and they're ecstatic and happy, but until they find out that the person next to them got $2.1 million bonus, and then they're miserable, right? And I think that's a great example of the wealth game versus status game, right? If you're thinking this is a wealth game, that's a great outcome. Oh, great, I had $2 million. The second it turns into a status game where it's relative, well, hey, someone else got $2.1 million and it's less than them, that's when people get miserable. And that, looking at it through that frame, is a zero-sum game. So like I said, I think it's a great kind of just frame to think about things in wealth games versus status games, and understanding that wealth games are positive sum and status games are zero sum, and then tying that back into the lesson that we learned from Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett on how the world is run by envy, not greed, because that envy revolves around those status games and it's zero sum. So I thought that was super interesting. Last idea, we're wrapping up here, is something that Naval says is just one of his favorite quotes. He said he read it first when he was like 8 or 9, and it's just stuck with him ever since. He talks about how Richard Feynman is essentially one of his idols, was an idol when he was a kid and still is. If you don't know, Richard Feynman is I want to say he won a Nobel Peace Prize, just a very famous physicist. He came up with a lot of new ideas that turned out to be correct. But one of the things that he had was this quote that the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And then one of the quotes from the book, Naval says, the more desire I have for something to work out a certain way, the less likely I am to see the truth, especially in business. If something isn't going well, I try to acknowledge it publicly, and I try to acknowledge it publicly in front of my co-founders and friends and coworkers. Then I'm not hiding it from anybody else. I'm not hiding it from anybody, and I'm not going to delude myself from what's actually going on. So there's 2 reasons I pulled that quote from the book. Number one is, obviously it ties into this principle that he has from Richard Feynman. The first principle is you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. So this is an example of Naval, like, hey, this is what I do to make sure that I don't fool myself. I go around telling my coworkers, my friends, my co-founders that if something's not going well in business, I'm going to tell them, because if I tell them, that's going to make sure that I don't delude myself. I think that's an interesting way to go about following this principle of not fooling yourself. Now, the second thing that I thought of when I read this was going back to that holistic selfishness, right? Going back to that idea of like, hey, if I do things selfishly, but I'm looking long-term, that's going to be best for me, right? What he's doing here, he is doing the right thing. He's saying, hey, when things are not going well in business, I make sure that I publicly acknowledge it in front of my co-founders, my friends, and my co-workers. That is the honest thing to do. That is something that you want to do and you want to communicate. But he's not saying that he does that because it's the right thing to do for them. He actually says that he's doing that so that I don't delude myself from what's actually going on. So I thought that was just a really interesting example of him using that idea of kind of like aligning his selfish intentions with what's best for everybody else, right? He's doing this action of telling everyone when things are going bad. He's doing it selfishly, so he doesn't delude himself. But as a byproduct, he's also doing the right thing for everybody else around him. So, like I said, I thought that was just a super interesting quote from him. I love the line from Richard Feynman because I think it's true. I think there's so many times where I've definitely fooled myself, and I'm very easy to fool. It's easy for me to fool myself if I want to, and you got to make sure that you stay away from it. And like I said, I thought it was just a really cool example of that holistic selfishness of him saying that he's doing this thing for him because it's best for him, but at the same time, it's the best outcome for everybody else. So I thought it was a great example. So with that, I'm going to end the podcast. Like I said, I barely hit on there's so much in this book and that Naval talks about in the podcast that I did not cover here, especially when it comes to the skill of wealth creation and the skill of being happy. That's what this book, the Almanack of Naval Ravikant, mainly focuses on. I believe you can actually get this a PDF of this book for free online. So definitely check that out. I mean, the book is cheap. The Kindle is cheap. But take the time, dive in on the book. Like I said, he was on the Joe Rogan podcast. He was on the Tim Ferriss podcast twice. He was on the Modern Wisdom podcast. He has his own podcast where he does a lot of talking about what's covered in this book. I think actually a lot of the quotes from this book are pulled from his podcast as well. So if you listen to his podcast, that'll cover a lot of the same book in here, a lot of the same information that's in the book here. So with that, I'll call it a day. And yeah, I think that's all I have.